The city of Chicago stretched before him, a maze of towering skyscrapers, bustling streets, and endless opportunity. Daniel Okafor inhaled deeply as he stepped out of his rental car, gazing up at the elegant, glass-paneled Bennett Tower, a high-rise apartment complex that gleamed like a promise of a better future. He clutched the folder in his hand, his proof that he was more than qualified for this place. His job as a senior IT consultant had finally paid off. After years of struggle, sleepless nights coding in his tiny Lagos apartment, and a master's degree earned through sheer determination, he had made it. He wasn't just another immigrant trying to scrape by. He was a success story. And this apartment, this was his reward. Daniel adjusted his neatly pressed shirt and exhaled slowly. Stay calm, stay professional. It was just another step in the journey. But the moment Richard Bennett stepped into the leasing office, Daniel felt it, the shift in energy. Richard, the building's 60-year-old landlord, had the stiff posture of a man who had built his wealth from the ground up, or at least liked to think he had. His neatly combed silver hair and crisp navy blazer screamed old money. He glanced at Daniel briefly, his pale blue eyes unreadable, before plastering on a thin, businesslike smile. "Mr. Okafor, was it?" His voice was clipped, his handshake barely a brush of fingers before he withdrew. Daniel nodded, extending his folder. "Yes, sir. I believe I meet all the leasing requirements. Solid credit, steady income, and I can pay the security deposit up front." Richard barely glanced at the papers before setting them aside. Instead, his eyes flickered over Daniel, not at his credentials, but at him. A beat of silence. Then Richard cleared his throat. "I like to be very selective about my tenants." He gestured for Daniel to follow him down the hallway toward the apartment. "We have a certain community here. Long-term tenants, professionals. We try to maintain a certain standard." Daniel furrowed his brow but said nothing. Standard? What did that mean? The apartment itself was stunning, spacious, modern, floor-to-ceiling windows with a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. Exactly what Daniel had envisioned when he planned his move to the U.S. It was perfect, but something felt off. Richard moved through the tour briskly, barely stopping to explain the features. The stainless steel appliances, the granite countertops, the smart lighting, all of it was rushed past like a formality. And then came the questions. "So, you're working in IT?" Richard asked casually, leaning against the marble kitchen island. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. "I work for TechCore Systems. Just started last month, but my contract is long-term." Richard nodded slowly, crossing his arms. "TechCore? Never heard of it. Is it a stable company?" The question caught Daniel off guard. Why would that matter? "It's one of the fastest-growing firms in the industry," Daniel replied, his voice steady but firm. "They work with Fortune 500 clients." Richard hummed. Then another question. "And how long do you plan on staying in the States?" Daniel frowned slightly. "Permanently, sir." Another pause. Another unreadable look. Then a forced chuckle. "I see." They walked into the master bedroom, but Daniel wasn't admiring the view anymore. He was analyzing Richard. The tension in the air was growing thicker, heavier. And then came the final blow. Richard exhaled dramatically and clapped his hands together. "Well, Mr. Okafor, I'll have to run your application and get back to you, but..." He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I do have a few others interested. I just want to make sure we select the right fit for our community." Daniel felt his stomach drop. He had seen this before. The coded language, the polite rejection disguised as process. And the final confirmation? 2 days later, the apartment was mysteriously unavailable, only for Daniel to see it relisted the next morning, for someone else. At first, Daniel tried to convince himself it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe there was a real reason. Maybe someone else had applied before him. But then, while scrolling through an apartment hunting forum, he saw the proof. A new tenant, a white man, had posted a photo of his lease approval, signed the same day Daniel had been rejected. Daniel's chest tightened as he scanned the details. The man had less income, a lower credit score. No better qualifications than Daniel, except for the color of his skin, his hands clenched into fists. The sting of rejection had morphed into something else now. Rage. He paced his small temporary apartment, mind racing. He had spent his entire life playing by the rules, working twice as hard to prove himself, only to be shut out by an unspoken rule that had nothing to do with merit. This isn't just unfair. This is illegal. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew discrimination existed. Of course he did. He had seen it, heard about it. But feeling it firsthand, having his future stolen from him right before his eyes? Number not this time. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I need your help. I think I was discriminated against." A long silence on the other end. Then his co-worker, Sarah Johnson, sighed. "I was hoping you wouldn't say that," she admitted. "But I believe you." "Then what do I do?" A pause. Then her voice, steady and firm. "You fight, and I know just the person who can help." Daniel stared out at the city skyline, his reflection staring back at him in the darkened window. He had fought for everything in his life, his education, his career, his place in a country that was supposed to be built on opportunity. And now he was about to fight again, this time for justice. Daniel sat at the corner table of Cafe Verona, a small coffee shop near his office. His hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee, but he barely took a sip. The events of the past few days replayed in his mind like a cruel joke. Across from him, Sarah Johnson stirred her latte, her expression unreadable. She had been his closest friend at TechCore Systems, the one person who had helped him navigate the cultural maze of corporate America. But today there was no lighthearted banter, just a heavy silence between them. Finally, Sarah sighed. "Daniel, I was hoping I was wrong, but this..." She slid her phone across the table. Daniel picked it up. His pulse quickened. There it was, a screenshot from an online housing forum. A man named Brad Turner had posted about his smooth move-in experience at Bennett Tower, just days after Daniel had been rejected. And the worst part? Brad openly admitted to having a lower income and weaker credit. Daniel's jaw tightened. So it was never about my qualifications. He exhaled sharply, pushing the phone away. I knew it. He didn't even try to hide it. Sarah leaned forward, her voice low. "This is illegal, Daniel. Clear housing discrimination. You have a case." Daniel looked up at her, frustration flickering in his eyes. "And what do I do? Sue him? Take on a powerful landlord with more money and connections than I can count?" Sarah's gaze was unwavering. "You don't have to do it alone." She pulled a business card from her purse and slid it across the table. "Lisa Carter, civil rights attorney. Call her," she urged. "She specializes in housing discrimination cases. If anyone can help you, it's her." Daniel hesitated, staring at the card. His instincts told him to walk away, to take the loss, move on, find another apartment. But another part of him, the part that had fought for everything he had, refused to let this slide. He clenched his fists under the table. Number not this time. Daniel sat across from Lisa Carter, a no-nonsense attorney with sharp eyes and a presence that commanded attention. She flipped through the folder of documents he had brought, his rejection letter, his financial records, the screenshot from the forum. As she read, her expression darkened. Finally, she closed the folder and looked up. "This is blatant discrimination. We need proof. Hard proof." Daniel's stomach nodded. "Like what?" Lisa leaned forward. "We catch him in the act." Her plan was simple yet brilliant. Undercover testers. A white colleague would apply for the same apartment. Phone call recordings. They would catch Richard in his own words. Paper trail. Any inconsistencies in his official reasoning. Daniel nodded slowly. "And if we prove it?" Lisa's lips curled into a smirk. "We make him pay." 3 days later, Daniel sat in his car, watching as Mark, a white co-worker from TechCore, walked into Bennett Tower's leasing office. The plan was simple. Mark would submit an identical application, same income, same job, same details. If Richard approved him, they would have undeniable proof. Minutes passed. Then Mark stepped out, phone in hand. The text came through almost instantly. "He approved me on the spot. Said I was the perfect fit for the community. No credit check. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Rage bubbled in his chest. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. It wasn't just paranoia. It was fact. A week later, Richard Bennett sat in his office, completely unaware of what was coming. He barely looked up when Lisa walked in, Daniel right behind her. "I hope this is quick," Richard muttered. "I have a meeting." Lisa slid a stack of papers onto his desk. "Then let's get straight to the point. This is a formal notice of a fair housing complaint against you, filed with the Department of Housing and Urban Development." Richard's eyes snapped up. Lisa continued, her voice calm but firm. "You rejected my client's application despite him meeting every requirement. Yet you approved a white applicant with weaker financials. That, Mr. Bennett, is illegal." Richard scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "This is nonsense. I can rent to whoever I want." Lisa smirked. "Not when you violate federal law." She reached into her folder and placed another document on the table. "Here's a transcript of your recorded phone call with my associate. When she asked if you had any diversity policies for your tenants, you said, and I quote, 'We like to keep a certain look in this building.'" Richard's face turned red. Lisa wasn't done. "We also have written proof that a white applicant was approved without a credit check while Daniel was denied. The evidence is overwhelming." For the first time, Richard looked nervous. But still, he sneered. "This won't go anywhere. Even if you file a complaint, what are you going to do? Drag me to court?" Lisa smiled. "Oh, we're way ahead of you." She slid one last document across the desk. An official notice from HUD. An investigation was already underway. Days later, the media caught wind of the case. "Landlord under investigation for housing discrimination." The headlines spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. People shared their own horror stories. Old tenants came forward. Richard's shady practices weren't new. He had been doing this for years. Reporters showed up outside Bennett Tower, cameras rolling. Inside, Richard sat in his office, watching the news play on the screen. His phone rang. His lawyer. His heart pounded. He had underestimated Daniel, and now he was paying the price. As Daniel watched the news unfold, Sarah nudged him. "You did this." He exhaled. He wasn't done yet. The legal battle was just beginning. But for the first time, Richard Bennett was the one on the losing side. The air inside the federal courthouse was thick with tension. The murmurs of spectators, the shuffling of papers, the rhythmic tapping of Daniel's foot against the cold tile floor, all blended into a low hum of anticipation. At the front of the room, Richard Bennett sat rigidly beside his lawyer, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. Gone was the smug confidence, the arrogant smirk. His tailored suit didn't hide the nervous sweat dampening his collar. On the other side of the courtroom, Daniel inhaled deeply. This was it. Months of frustration, anger, and relentless fighting had led to this moment. Justice was within reach. Lisa Carter, his attorney, stood with her signature composure. She was calm, sharp, and utterly in control, a lioness ready to strike. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the Fair Housing Act is clear. Mr. Bennett not only discriminated against my client, but also engaged in a pattern of rejecting black applicants while favoring white tenants with weaker qualifications." She laid a thick folder onto the table. "We have records, testimonies, and even direct admissions from the defendant himself." Richard's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Then Lisa dropped the bombshell. A recording played through the courtroom speakers. Richard's voice crackled to life. "We like to keep a certain look in this building." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Richard's face drained of color. Lisa turned to the judge, her voice unwavering. "This is not just unethical, it's illegal." The judge peered over his glasses. "Mr. Bennett, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Richard's lawyer tried to object, but the damage was done. The ruling came swiftly. Richard Bennett was found guilty of racial discrimination. The penalties were severe, a hefty fine of $250,000, compensation for Daniel and previous tenants who had been wrongfully rejected, a federal order barring him from real estate management for the next decade, mandatory diversity training, the irony wasn't lost on anyone, public record exposure, his name now forever tied to housing discrimination. As the gavel slammed down, Richard slumped in his chair, defeated. His empire was crumbling. The courtroom doors barely closed before the media frenzy erupted outside. Disgraced landlord loses lawsuit over racist practices. Richard Bennett banned from managing properties. Former tenants speak out. This was long overdue. The lawsuits piled up. One after another, former tenants stepped forward with their own horror stories. The floodgates had opened. And then the final blow came. Richard's bank revoked his loan. The financial institution, fearing his mounting legal troubles, pulled their support. Without it, Richard couldn't afford to keep the building afloat. Bennett Tower was foreclosed, and the new owner, a black real estate investor, a man who had once been rejected by Richard years ago. The first thing he did? Offer Daniel an apartment at a discount. Standing in his new apartment, Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Floor-to-ceiling windows, polished hardwood floors, and a skyline view. Everything he had fought for. Sarah popped a bottle of champagne in celebration. "I hope Richard sees this." Daniel smirked, raising his glass. "Oh, he will." But this wasn't just about his apartment anymore. It was about something bigger. Daniel didn't stop at his own victory. He joined forces with housing advocacy groups, using his case as a rallying cry for justice. His story made waves, inspiring new policies and tougher enforcement of fair housing laws. And soon other victims of discrimination found their voices. His fight wasn't just personal anymore. It was a movement. Racism in housing still exists, but justice is possible if you're willing to fight. Have you or someone you know faced housing discrimination? Share your story in the comments. Let's hold landlords accountable.